And President Trump will not change. Isolationism, I brought it up today. The president I serve with is not an isolationist. In fact, he has a strong secondary sanctions. And so I don't think, I said in my first trip to Europe as vice president, it was always my impression, America first doesn't mean America alone, but it does mean that our allies would live up to their word to do their part, and $140 billion more of investments by our NATO allies after our first 4 years was evidence that our allies across Europe, here in the UK, did the same. So I don't think you should have the view, other than we should all take the view that this is a real moment of testing of the West. But I think you'll continue to see American leadership.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you about it. You introduced yourself after my introduction, dwelling on what it means to come from a state that makes a lot of things and exports them to the world. Do you think the tariffs that President Trump has brought in will outlast his administration?
Well, I hope not. In fact, the Supreme Court of the United States is now currently evaluating whether or not the statute the president has used to impose unilateral tariffs against friend and foe alike is even constitutional.
That is claiming that it is an emergency, using that as the basis for these tariffs.
Claiming it's an emergency statute, that there's a global emergency. But under our Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, it provides that taxes and tariffs, which were called imposts back in the day, can only be enacted by the Congress. The small foundation that I started a few years ago in Washington, D.C. has filed briefs, one of which was cited in the Court of Appeals case, that we don't believe the president's use of that statute is consistent with the Constitution. And my hope is that a majority of the Supreme Court will conclude the same. I mean, the simple truth is that at the American founding, taxes on tea were kind of an issue. Those were tariffs. And so by the time they got around to that second draft of an American government in 1787 that we call the Constitution of the United States, the one thing they wanted to make clear was that no one person could impose import tariffs and taxes on the American people, that it would be done by the elected representatives of the American people. I'm hopeful that our Supreme Court will draw the same conclusion. Because as we've argued, and as people in the UK understand, whether it's your tariffs here on our goods coming in, or our tariffs on exports from the UK to the United States, I've made it clear that with the exception of maybe a small impact at the margin, that American businesses and American consumers pay American tariffs. And I think the concession by our administration just in the last few days that they were lifting tariffs on coffee and beef to lower prices at the grocery store kind of made my point. So I think the American people are sensing this. I think we're seeing inflation. We're seeing impacts in our economy, and my hope is that that whether it's the Supreme Court or whether the administration continues to tack and adjust, that we will return to using tariffs the way we did in our administration, which was we used tariffs and the threat of tariffs to negotiate down tariffs and trade barriers and non-tariff subsidies. I mean, President Trump threatened to do away with NAFTA and impose harsh tariffs on Canada and Mexico. It set the stage for us to negotiate the largest trade deal in American history, the USMCA. I was sent to give a major speech to the City of London to say that when Brexit was done, we were already putting together working groups to begin to negotiate a free trade agreement with the UK. I mean, it seems to me tariffs have their use, as a means of facilitating negotiation, but in economic policy, I believe, with the exception of China, because honestly, after decades of trade abuses, intellectual property theft, I think we've got to stand firm on China. But other than that, I believe in free trade with free nations. And it's one of the ways the free world will prosper and prevail.
Thank you very much for that. You mentioned the Supreme Court, and I wanted to ask you about the quality of democracy in the US itself. We've got quite a lot of questions online on that, including one from Haida Iqbal. Thank you. I'm thinking both of the January 6th challenge, but even of a remark by the president in the White House last night at a press conference where he asked a question by ABC News, uncomfortable to his guest, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and suggested that ABC's license, one of the main broadcasters of the US, should be taken away. What about the quality of democracy in the US? What should the rest of the world make of it?
I'm very confident about American democracy. The American people cherish our representative government. They cherish, and I believe you'll see celebrations next year all across the country in big cities and small towns, remembering the signing of a Declaration of Independence, the ideals enshrined there. And my confidence really comes from having not only served in the Congress and as a governor and as vice president, traveled across our country continuously, but Karen and I, after we left the White House, we moved home to Indiana. We bought 5 acres and a pond, a riding mower, pickup truck. So we spent a lot of time traveling around the country, as well as just living in the heartland. And I have to tell you, there has not a day gone by traveling anywhere across the United States that I haven't been deeply humbled by having people come up to me on the right, on the left, everywhere in between, and express appreciation for our service, particularly on that fateful day. And it has reiterated to me the deep love the American people have for our Constitution. You know, we've had a few elections since then. There have been reforms at the state level for elections. The 2022 elections went off without a hitch. 24 elections worked out just fine for the president. We just had midterm elections, less so, but without controversy. And I think you can be confident the American people are going to continue to demand that we live up to that ideal and that principle of representative democracy.
I know there are going to be a lot of questions, so let me just ask you one more. You mentioned some points where you thought the UK was going wrong. We have the budget next week, where the Chancellor is expected to bring in a lot of tax rises and is grappling with the rising size of the state here. These are principles you've argued against all your life. Is this somewhere where you think the UK is going wrong?
Well, I would just caution friends about ignoring the real threat to the long-term security and prosperity of both of our countries, and that's public debt. And let me, before
I have to say the U.S. is in a worse position than the UK on that.
I was about to say, before I criticize my friends, when I arrived in Congress, our national debt was $3 or $4 trillion. It's $38 trillion today and rising. When I ran for president back in 2023, not so where you'd notice. But it was a rich experience. But I think only of the 8 candidates in that primary, not counting the one that won, only 2 of us were talking about the national debt. Only 2 of us were talking about the only real way to solve the national debt is with compassionate reforms of the entitlement programs that consume more than